Just as a production note, those of you listening on the podcast feed or watching on YouTube might hear some sound in the background or see my little one running around. I've kind of hit a point in the show where I'm not going to try to keep my kids out of camera. I don't like doing it. It makes me unhappy. It makes them unhappy. And I think we're all grown-ups here and we can just deal with the fact that sometimes kids are in your life and sometimes they make a little bit of noise. Season 2 of The Rings of Power is upon us. As with Season 1, that means that most of the Tolkien talk online is going to be really depressing, some of it angry, and almost all of it about how bad the show is. I usually love an excuse to talk about an adaptation of a great work of literature for the stage or screen, but in this case, I can't do it because, as I've said before, Rings of Power just isn't an adaptation. There's a couple of characters who have the same names as characters that Tolkien wrote, but they don't look or behave like them. And the rest of the plot just has absolutely nothing to do with any of Tolkien's stories. On top of that, I just found that it wasn't a very good show. I didn't understand why any of the characters were making the decisions that they were, and the plot was sort of boring. Nothing really happened. So instead of just contributing to all the negativity around that, I thought instead I would do as I did with Season 1 and try to do something related to Tolkien's work that's more positive, that helps us learn more about why we love these books so much and, what goes right when an adaptation is done well. And so what I want to look at is how Howard Shore adapted The Lord of the Rings to music. Now, I don't mean that he adapted it in the way that some stories become musicals, like, say, The Secret Garden or Matilda. That really wouldn't work with The Lord of the Rings unless you're doing some sort of comedy thing. What I mean is that Howard Shore paid very careful attention to the text of The Lord of the Rings, and he did whatever he could to interpret that text in the musical storytelling of the soundtrack. If you teach teenagers who are deepening their understanding of both music and literature, you can use this to start telling them about concepts like leitmotifs, themes, and storytelling through music. By the time kids are high school age, they're not only ready for more advanced literature like The Lord of the Rings, but if they're musical, they'll also be ready to start analyzing music and even writing their own compositions. Studying works by great composers can really help them understand the building blocks of musical storytelling. But most kids would rather eat a block of violin rosin than start out by listening to Wagner. It's much better to start out with a story and musical score that they're probably already familiar with. The first thing that Howard Shore did right with the Lord of the Rings soundtrack was to include lyrics that Tolkien himself wrote. This is the most direct way to musically interpret a work of literature. Tolkien only wrote lyrics, though, never any tunes. As he explained in one of his famous letters, "I have little musical knowledge. Though I come of a musical family, owing to defects of education and opportunity as an orphan, such music as was in me was submerged until I married a musician or transformed into linguistic terms. Music gives me great pleasure and sometimes inspiration, but I remain in the position in reverse of one who likes to read or hear poetry, but knows little of its technique or tradition, or of linguistic structure." This shows respectable humility. Although Tolkien couldn't write music for his own lyrics, he liked it when others did. He had warm praise in particular for the settings done by Donald Swann. So it's completely accurate to the books and the author's wishes for Howard Shore to come up with tunes that express Tolkien's lyrics. Right at the beginning of the movie, we hear Gandalf singing, "The road goes ever on." There's an earlier version of this song in The Hobbit, but the lyrics changed slightly when they were put into The Lord of the Rings. This makes sense because there have always been variations on folk songs. The book doesn't describe Gandalf coming into town, but it's much more cinematic to show this in the film, and it gives the chance to show off the Shire as he rolls in on his cart. I also like that Gandalf sings this song as he enters Hobbiton with everyone's attention on him, and then Bilbo sings it as he slips away unnoticed after his birthday party. That part does happen in the book, and Peter Jackson interpreted this scene very accurately. The use of the song "The Road Goes Ever On" is a great way to introduce kids to the idea of music that is either inside the story or outside the story. The musical jargon for this is diegetic or non-diegetic music, but these terms can be hard to remember, and people tend to sound pretentious when they use them, so it might be easier to teach this idea using the terms inside the story or outside the story. When Gandalf and Bilbo sing this song, it's inside the story. The characters can hear this music because they're the ones making it. But at the same time, Howard Shore layered on music that is outside the story, the soundtrack that the characters can't hear. These two types of music interact really nicely at the beginning of the Fellowship of the Ring. There is this beautiful, cinematic feeling soundtrack, but it's pointed right at the song that the characters are singing, so the music is supporting not only the character development, but the plot of the story and your personal connection to it. In another episode, I'll talk more about Tolkien's songs that are sung inside the story, but for now we need to move on to the next thing that Howard Shore did perfectly, and that was to choose which instruments would play at certain moments based on which culture the music was describing. He didn't just write specific musical themes for different cultures in the film. He had the orchestra play them using only instruments that those cultures would have had access to. Music that describes the Shire and hobbits uses folk instruments that could have been manufactured by hobbits. Themes that describe the nation of Gondor use brass instruments, which require a more sophisticated level of manufacturing, but they have a mellow, elegant tone. This reflects the high level of craftsmanship and civilization that exists in Gondor. Brass instruments are also heavily used when playing themes about the evil characters in the story, but they're played harshly, showing Tolkien's contempt for the ways that technology could be used for destructive purposes. I'm most excited to talk about the theme that Howard Shore wrote for the people of Rohan, but I'll have to save that for another episode. My favorite way to look at literature is with an interdisciplinary point of view. I love to find ways to bring different subjects, math, science, astronomy, cooking, music, into literature. It makes learning so much more fun and effective. I also hope this little project can bring some positivity to the discussion about adapting Tolkien's work at a time when most of it is going to be pretty negative. 2 years ago, when Season 1 of The Rings of Power came out, I made a similar effort. I took a look at the song lyrics in The Hobbit and closely read the text of the book. Then I tried to create music that matched what Tolkien wrote. I'd rather refer to these songs as musical experiments rather than proper compositions, but if you haven't heard them before, I would really appreciate finding out what you think of them. I'll provide links in the show notes. I also have free sheet music for these experiments at children'sliteraturepodcast.com. Which of Tolkien's lyrics are your favorite? Which musical settings have been the most moving to you? I'd love to hear all about it.